Good morning again, everyone. This is going to be part two of Meaning of Cultures. You should have already gone through part one, but we stopped here essentially because I needed to transition us to the European continent. We had been talking about quite expressly about those Mesoamerican cultures, and we didn't go through them in great detail. If you'd like to do that, you can do some reading on your own, or you can take Chicano Studies with Dr. Guerrero. Dr. Guerrero is a extremely competent faculty member at Los Angeles City College, and he teaches Chicano Studies courses. And you can learn quite a bit from his Chicano 44, which is Mexican civilization. But he does talk quite a bit about those civilizations and how more developed they were than I do, since this is obviously an American history class. But now you have some basic understanding, and you can do a lot of research on your own to kind of round out what I told you. But now what we're doing is we're moving towards the European continent, because we need to discuss the ways in which the European continent, essentially why they made the move to come and do some exploring. So we want to look at the European continent around the 14th century. That's a good beginning point. We could go back much further, but we have to start somewhere, so that's a good one for sake of time. If you take a look at a map of Europe today, and I suggest that you should do that, you will notice that the European countries, like many of the African countries, have these really interesting shapes to them. And those shapes are a product of thousands of years of wars, culture, uh, just people moving back and forth, the borders being shifted through contestation between other nations. Nation loses a war, the boundaries get changed, people get subsumed, people speaking one language are subsumed into a country where they can't speak the language, and vice versa. But then if you take a look at a map of 1300s Europe, or the Europe in the 14th century, you will find that it looks quite different than what you would seem to have today. There were literally hundreds and hundreds of small little kingdoms. For example, today in the country of Spain, there were about three or four different countries. There was the Kingdom of Majorca, the Kingdom of Granada, the Kingdom of Castile, the Kingdom of Aragon. So there were quite a number of them. By 1492 or so, 1491 or so, that area, the Iberian Peninsula, which is now Spain, would be consolidated into one country by Ferdinand and Isabella, and that would be the ending of Moorish rule in Spain. So you can just see that if you can find a map of 1300s. You can try going to www.euratlas.com, www.euratlas.com, euratlas.com, and you can find some really cool maps that'll show you that. Now, the kinds of governments that these European countries had ranged in their quality and their differences. England had a constitutional monarchy where the nobles and the king had signed what we call the Great Charter, the Magna Carta. And this Great Charter set out and laid out the relationship between the king and the lords of England. It didn't have anything to do with common people. The lords wanted to know what their rights were vis-a-vis the king. These individuals recognized that the people do need a king, and there was an agreement about who shall be a king, but that should be done based upon an agreement between the nobles and the king and what their rights would be. In Milan, that's in Italy, it's a city-state, they had a military dictatorship. Italy as a country wasn't around until the 19th century, so they've got many hundred years before they actually consolidate themselves into a country. Rome, obviously, was ruled by a theocracy with the Vatican. France, they had an absolute monarchy where the king ruled absolutely, unlike in England, where the king ruled through constitutional monarchy and support from the lords. In France, the king sees themselves as absolute dominion and doesn't need any particular the agreement between the lords, because the individual who is king sees themselves to be gods incarnate here on earth. In Poland, there is a parliamentary government, Aragon, social contract. Social contract is essentially, pretty basically, an agreement by the people and the rulers about what their duties will be and what the duties of the rulers will be. Switzerland, they had pure democracy, and so some of these small towns in Switzerland, you could literally go and voice your sentiments and conduct business affairs of the government in groups. I mean, literally, you had a voice in the government. Unlike today here in the United States, we do have voice in government, but that's through the petition process. But in the social contract, no, there's no petition process per se. You can actually have real say in government. In Florence, political machine, right? So you can see from that they have varying differences of government, and you should have some basic understanding of the varying kinds of government that exist throughout this time period and throughout the world. From the 15th through the 17th centuries, we note this time period as the Age of Discovery. And this time period is really important because there are certain things that are going to happen within the European continent. Commercial expansion, navigation tools, map making, growth and threat of Islam towards the east. These 3 centuries, these 300 years or so, were deeply rooted in the inventions that came out of the Renaissance. And then that essentially meant a heavily borrowing of Islamic ideas that flowed from Islam into the Middle Ages and then into the Renaissance. And quite extraordinary is that Europeans took a lot of this culture and the inventions. So in culture, we talk about coffee shops that was invented in the Middle East, chess invented in the Middle East, the idea that you could operate on people. The Islamic countries were performing cataract surgery, curing the common cold, inventing hospitals, libraries. Their streets had lights and they were modern grown flowers, where Europe essentially in the Middle Ages most of the cities lived in absolute poverty and squalor. These towns in Europe were basically built around, in some cases, rivers. So there was a natural supply of water, but it also meant a natural supply to dump your garbage into them. And of course, the cities smelled rotten, and that's where we get things like perfume, right? Where Europeans would actually create perfume out of flower petals, and they would sprinkle it on their handkerchiefs, and then they would hold it up to their noses because the smell in the streets was just putrefying. Also, another interesting thing is that in places like jolly old England, where you'd get up in the morning and you'd open up your window and you would see all the people walking through the streets, and this would be William Shakespeare's time, right? People would be walking through the streets to work, but they'd all be walking in the middle of the street. And the reason why that is because people would open up their doors after they woke up and they'd throw their bedpans with all their stuff from their evening, and instead of going to the bathroom, they just went into the bedpans and they would throw that out into the street. So people would make sure that they were, walking away from, people's windows. But this information and all this stuff that was fed into or invented by the Muslims was brought into Europe and used, and we get things like navigation tools, cartography, and that's going to help spur Europe into unprecedented growth, and of course that would eventually come over from the United States. The first country I'm going to talk about in Europe just very briefly is the Kingdom of Portugal. And why the Kingdom of Portugal is because they were one of the first European countries outside of the Norse to start exploring in detail, and they will evidently helped spur the African slave trade, them along with Spain. Um, but we begin with Portugal. Um, One, Portugal's geography, it's on the coast of the Iberian Peninsula. They were devoutly Catholic and had strong ties to the Catholic Church and the Pope. And this geography and this religious zeal of wanting to convert souls, um, this would help spur. There was also a necessity to find alternative routes of trade to the Far East. So if you were to take a caravan by land going east, let's say to China, that you would eventually run into Muslims, and if you were a Christian, that might not be such a good thing. So you were trying to find ways around the Islamic countries in order to make your trip much more safer. And so then that spur, and what they were trying to do is go to China. And of course, individuals like Marco Polo had brought back, stories and legends and treasures, and not just Marco Polo. There were quite a number of other people, right, who would move around, especially a lot of Muslims, right, like Ibn Khaldun, Ibn Battuta, people like that. But we'll get into that a little bit later on. But those are the things that spurred them, of course, in intellectual and economic motives. People just want to know what's out there in the world. The most interesting figure is Prince Henry the Navigator. He wasn't a seafarer by any stretch of the imagination, but he helped push Portugal's seafaring industry, and hence the name Henry the Navigator. 1394 to 1460. Prince Henry's goals were, as a young man, were to know the world beyond Portugal, as all young people have this desire to go out and discover the world. Obviously, opening up more trade relations, wanting to know the extent of Muslim power, and something quite interesting, and that is looking for a man named Prester John or Prater John, depending on how you want to pronounce the name or see the name. And also, they wanted, of course, as I said it earlier, to spread the religious message and obviously spreading Christianity. And I'll get back to Prester John in just a minute. So the thing here to note is that trading routes were vastly important for people's obviously economic motives, but it's also people want different things that they may not necessarily have in their countries, like spices. They traded cinnamon, ginger, turmeric, herbs, incense, even drugs like opium. They traded these 400 years before the birth of Christ, going through thousands of years, at least 1,000 years after the death. So the trade routes throughout the Far East, Middle East, and in Europe were quite extensive, and depending upon whether or not there were good relations with the individuals along the path, depended upon whether or not your trade routes were secure. Now, we have individuals like Vasco da Gama, who set out in 1497 to discover a trade route, and that's, of course, years after Christopher Columbus's trek. And if you find a map of Vasco da Gama's route, you can see that he takes a southern sea route that goes around the southern South African peninsula and up through to the Far East. You'll be able to see that on a map. But the essential goal here is to find alternative routes of trade. With Prester John, there's a fascinating map that I'd like to show you that really explains in quite detail. So if you kind of do a Google search for Prester John, you'll find the map. But what this map holds is an individual sitting on a throne. And this person is a dark-skinned person, so obviously African, who's holding a gold nugget, wearing a gold scepter, and holding a gold scepter and wearing a gold crown. And there are Muslim mosques around him. And essentially, the basic premise to this was that there was a Christian king in the middle of Africa who was surrounded by Muslims, and it was the duty and the calling of every Christian noble and king to try to save this individual from the hordes of Muslim. Well, there was really no person named Prester John alive. That was just a fictional story that circled around Europe. But there was a man we historians now believe who they confused with Prester John, and this person actually did live. His name was Mansa Kankan Musa. And what the deal is with Mansa Musa is that he was at the time period believed to have been the world's richest man. He lived around 1280 to 1337. And the name Mansa Musa just means king of kings. So Musa, that's essentially what the term means. Mansa meaning king. So Mansa Musa, the king of kings, he was the 10th king. He was head of the Malayan Empire, and that Malayan Empire stretched quite considerably through Ghana and Mali and surrounding areas. So if you take out a map and you see that, you'll know the exact thing. But what's important about Mansa Musa was that he was a king who converted to Islam, and he made a pilgrimage to Mecca in 1324. As you know, that all good Muslims, at least once in our lives, are intended to take a pilgrimage to the Mecca, their holy land. And Mansa Musa made his in 1324. Why we know this is people wrote considerably about this, and they wrote about his journey, and this is how the story of Prester John circulated. In his caravan to Mecca, he brought 60,000 men and 12,000 slaves. Now, everybody get out your calculators because this is really important. So there were at least 72,000 people that went with Mansa Musa, and each carried a 4-pound gold bar. So if you factor 72,000 people each carrying a 4-pound gold bar, that's how much money that they basically brought with them. And at the time period, it was considered to be such a great amount of money that there was danger in this, because if that caravan with 72,000 people were to come into your town carrying all this gold, they would buy up everything, and everybody essentially would become rich, and money then would become worthless. Why would money become worthless? Because then money would no longer be scarce, everybody would have it, and then the value of that gold would then plummet. He did this to several cities, and their economies were destroyed. So, on the way back from his journey, town leaders who would be watching out for this guy, they would literally stop him and forbid him from coming into their towns, fearing that he would literally destroy their economies. There were reports that not only did each one of these individuals carry gold bars, but there were 80 camels carrying 50 to 300 pounds of gold dust each. One of the things about Mansa Musa, which made him such an incredible character, is he was incredibly generous. He literally handed out gold to the poor that he met on his route. So that's where the story kind of circulated, that this guy named Prester John. The Portuguese eventually would set up trade routes along the coast of Africa in as much an attempt to not only do some trading, but to find this individual named Prester John. And you can see, well, they would establish the ports in 1434. That would be Cape Bajador, Cape Rio de Oro, Cape Branco, Cape Verde, the Red Cape. All of these were established on the coast of Africa from 1434 to 1445. We also have the Kingdom of Spain, and of course this is Isabel and Ferdinand, where they funded Christopher Columbus's voyage in 1492. As you might expect, Christopher Columbus was not actually a Spaniard, but he was an Italian. He was Cristobal Colombo, who went looking for anyone who would fund his belief that he could discover an alternative trade route to the Far East. It was not Christopher Columbus's intent to discover new lands, but to discover new trade routes. And of course, he never found those new trade routes, but he did, in fact, discover new lands. Christopher Columbus had a couple assumptions. One, he believed that the world was actually smaller than it was, so he didn't plan on taking that much food with him, as you saw from the map, his ships were rather small. He believed that he could travel west to get to the east, so he felt that he could cross the Atlantic and he would, in fact, end up being in the Far East, as opposed to doing something like traveling south, where Vasco da Gama would do that later on, right? And he would eventually make it because Christopher Columbus did not. He also believed that there was no landmass between Europe and Asia. So that's kind of an interesting thing. Christopher Columbus, by and large, was not a very well-liked man. As a matter of fact, he had been pushing after years of discovery to get the Americas named after him, and of course, nobody really liked him. So they named the Americas after Amerigo Vespucci instead. Christopher Columbus, in sailing in 1492, he's going to land in what we now called Haiti and the Dominican Republic in 1492. And this would begin in earnest the movement toward establishing a foothold in the Americas. Christopher Columbus would die in 1506, believing that he had actually, in fact, reached the East, as we know that he didn't. But he made 4 voyages, one from 1492 to 3, the second one from 1493 to 96, the third from 1498 to 1500, the fourth from 1502 to 04, and that's right before his death. And he never did find those routes because he kept hitting into now where we call the Isthmus of Panama and South America, and of course the areas around Nicaragua. Now, with all of this exploration comes the reach of Rome, right? The Vatican, of course, almost everybody in Europe is Catholic, and of course, these individuals hold an allegiance to the Catholic Church, so Rome would be interested. How Rome gets involved in all of this is, of course, what we call the doctrine of discovery, laying out the roadmap or the doctrines of how countries would act towards each other during their time period of trying to discover who would get particular lands or who would have access and right to lands. And all of this stuff would have to be mediated because if not, there would be wars. The Pope is going to issue several documents that would adjudicate how these countries, in fact, would act towards each other. The 3 ones that I'd like you to look at are Dum Diversas, Romanus Pontifex, and Inter Caetera. Dum Diversas, Diversas, was issued in 1492, and it allowed Catholics who were discovering to reduce those individuals who were not Catholic to, and they call these individuals Saracens and pagans, to slavery. Romanus Pontifex, Romanus Pontifex, 1455, and it established Portugal's rights to new lands in Africa. And then Inter Caetera, Caetera, 1493, it gave Spain access to lands and the right to discover lands to the west of Spain and to the south, excluding those territories discovered by Portugal and in those ones in Africa. So why this is important is we begin to see that Spain, or the Pope, is beginning to divide up these territories that are being discovered in the new, as they called the New World, between 2 kingdoms, the Kingdom of Portugal and the Kingdom of Spain. Excuse me. I'll just read you just a little bit of the wording of Dum Diversas so you can kind of get an idea about what these documents were saying. We grant you, the kings of Spain and Portugal, by these documents with our apostolic authority, full and free permission to invade, search out, capture, and subjugate the Saracens and pagans and any other unbelievers and enemies of Christ, wherever they may be, as well as their kingdoms, duchies, counties, principalities, and other property, and reduced their persons into perpetual slavery. This is an actual document that was issued by the Catholic Church, allowing these individuals to reduce everyone to slavery, including Africans and the Mesoamericans. The Mesoamericans, they would be slaughtered and reduced into slavery and sold all throughout the Americas. And the Africans, of course, would be brought all throughout the Americas. That's why you have black people from South America all the way up to into Canada. Now, with these two kingdoms discovering territories, of course, obviously, at some point, there's going to be contestation. By 1494, just 2 years after Columbus's voyages, there are threats of war between the two kingdoms. The Pope gathered these individuals, these two kingdoms, together at Tordesillas in 1494, which would result in a Treaty of Tordesillas that would spell out how these two countries would now operate. What they basically did is they got out a map and they divided the world between Kingdom and Portugal, excluding some territories in Brazil that the Portuguese had already documented, and the Pope gave all of those territories out west, the Americas, to Spain, and the rest of the territories that were not occupied or not quote-unquote discovered or not Christianized to Portugal. Now, if you really want to think about the audacity of a Catholic Pope basically dividing the world up between these two people, would they not ever expect that there would be people throughout the world? These Europeans actually fundamentally believed that they were at the center of the universe. That's hubris. Now, Spain's interesting foray into exploration would come at the expense of course, Mesoamericans, and it would be done by individuals that we call the Spanish conquistadors. And there is a film that I'm going to have you watch that would give you some indication about how all of this was done. But these early conquistadors had essentially three goals. One of them that you might recognize automatically, and that was the spreading of Christianity. The other one is establishing agricultural economies and finding other sources of wealth, and that's rather obvious. The spreading of Christianity, that's to save souls, they believed. Establishing agricultural economies, the food production to feed not only their populations back home, but populations that might, slave populations that might be, if they encountered these individuals and they were not Christian, they might harvest crops to feed those populations back home and their newly acquired populations, and of course finding sources of wealth. There were quite a number of conquistadors. You've probably heard the main ones like Hernan de Cortez. You've probably heard someone like Ponce de Leon, who was in Florida in 1519 trying to find the Fountain of Youth. There was Francisco de Montejo, 1527 to 1532. Pedro Alvarado, Hernan de Cordoba, Núñez de Balboa, Alonso de Hojeda, Juan Esquivel, Antonio de Berrio. There were quite a number of other conquistadors that you probably had not heard of, and these people had some or more success than others, right? Obviously, you've heard of people like Ponce de Leon and Hernan Cortez, but these individuals would be out looking for treasure. Now, with Spain and Portugal going out and seeking the riches, England wants to get into the game as well. So Henry VIII is going to start building a large navy, and we will see the voyages of John Cabot later on, and that's going to be England's first exploration. And coupled with all of this, we're going to see a large explosion of the English population. So England is going to want to take its poor and try to find some alternative employment. And also we begin to see the enclosure movement in England, where we begin to see the lords kicking people off their land, and these people are going to need new places to go. Giovanni Caboto, who would later be coined John Cabot, 1450-1499, received a patent from Henry the Seventh, or I'm sorry, Henry the Seventh, in 1496. We also are going to see the voyages of John Hawkins, who is going to start discovering lands in Africa in the 1560s, and probably the most prolific of all these individuals were Francis Drake, who would circumnavigate the globe and also plunder treasure from England, right? He would give us the quintessential pirateer. So these are the three individuals, John Cabot, John Hawkins, Francis Drake, that you should have some idea of who these individuals are. So John Cabot, of course, is going to found areas on his first voyage around the areas of Upper Canada, what they would call Labrador, and later Newfoundland. Sir Francis Drake will circumnavigate the globe from 1577 to 1580. He would start off in England, cut across the Atlantic Ocean down through South America, come up in by the Americas, and then shoot across the Pacific Ocean. Now, just a couple of things about geography. The Atlantic Ocean and the Pacific Ocean were named sort of somewhat deceptively, and so are some other areas within our geography. For example, the south of Africa is named the Cape of Good Hope. The original name was the Cape of Stormy Seas. They literally changed that name to the Cape of Good Hope because sailors would look at a map and see that it was called the Cape of Stormy Seas, and they would not want to sign themselves on those voyages. That area in South Africa, the waters can be quite treacherous, so individuals knew that there might not be a chance of ever coming back. So they changed the name to Cape of Good Hope to convince sailors to do that. Also, the Pacific Ocean is much more dangerous than the Atlantic Ocean by far, but they named it the Pacific, meaning peace, again, to make sailors believe that the Pacific Ocean, in fact, was not as dangerous as they've been hearing from rumors. There were early attempts by England to establish a foothold on the North American continent, and this began with Sir Humphrey Gilbert in 1576, Ralph Lane in 1585, John White in 1587. John White was trying to settle along the Chesapeake, and he took about 110 men and women. That settlement by John White disappeared. When they went in 1589, 2 years later, to see what happened to this settlement by John White, they didn't find anyone at all. The only thing that they found were words that were scratched on a tree, and those words were Croatoan, Croatoan, Croatoan. But we don't know what that was. We don't know if this was an Indian village or this was a person or what have you, but the colony completely vanished. So it's going to be an interesting thing years later if we could ever find out what happened to those individuals. But that was England's foray, and of course, it's not starting out well. But as we know, it would eventually start off in Jamestown and eventually yield to thriving British colonies and, of course, an American nation. Now, with these Europeans traversing around the globe and, of course, into the Americas, they're bringing lots of things with them. Some things that they're bringing with them, of course, they're bringing and taking back plants and animals that they're discovering, but they're also bringing back a whole lot of things with them. One of the things that Europeans, in fact, will bring to the Americas are things like lemons, horses. They will bring with them wheat. Native Americans never even saw things like wheat or bread. Those are just like corn is an invention of Mesoamerica. Things like grains are an invention of people in the Mesopotamic region, right? These foods did not exist or don't exist naturally. They were created by human beings. Oranges, lemons, as I said earlier. And the other thing that these individuals brought with them were smallpox. Google smallpox, and you could see the dangerous effects from it. It literally, if you get infected with it, it'll blister your entire body. And eventually, if you can't get cured from this, it'll kill you. And that's the thing that nearly wiped out these Mesoamerican cultures. There weren't enough conquistadors to kill off 100,000 Aztecs. So what killed them off was disease. So this is essentially how the Europeans would end up eventually dominate Mesoamericans. They did it, one, by bringing their germs. They had superior technology in terms of firearms. They had cannons and loading rifles, and that's the technology. And of course, the steel. So if you read Jared Diamond's book, he lays out quite concisely about how these things contributed to the destruction of these Mesoamerican populations. So it wasn't that these Europeans were any smarter or had any more advanced civilization. As I showed you, the Mesoamericans had advanced civilizations on their own. The Europeans just came armed with guns, germs, and steel, and this is what allowed them to dominate. So then you ask yourself, well, then what did the Mesoamericans give to the Europeans? Rather obvious: maize, corn, right? People eat corn all over the world. When I lived in Italy near the Venice area in a small town called Sicily, people grew their own corn, potatoes, chocolate, sunflower seeds, rubber, right? And they also brought syphilis, gonorrhea, venereal diseases, right? So this is the exchange. They brought in things like smallpox. What they gave out are things like venereal diseases, unknown to Europeans. So this is the end of Meeting of Civilizations. I hope that I was able to at least provide you with a framework. And as I stated earlier, we can't go into a lot of depth, but this is just in part and parcel some things for you to think about in terms of what you're going to be looking at and what you're going to be reading. A couple of things in the readings. When you sit down and to do the readings, I want you to pay attention to two particular aspects. I want you to look at the essential writing about the conquistadors and the Aztecs. Much of the belief throughout the modern world after 1492 was that when Hernan Cortez settled into or was beginning to conquer the Americas or the Aztec nation, that the Aztecs believed that he was a god. That is not true. The mythology of Quetzalcoatl is in fact a mythology. Quetzalcoatl was one of four principal deities of the Aztecs. But the Aztecs in no way believed that Hernan Cortez was Quetzalcoatl. That was a myth, or not a myth, I'm sorry, but a lie that was perpetuated by the Spaniards to make the Aztecs look a lot brighter than they actually were. The Native Americans did not believe that. So when you read the text, be very careful that you don't fall into the trap thinking that the Aztecs were destroyed because they falsely believed that Hernan Cortez was a god. That is not a true story. That story is not a mythology. Mythologies are in fact true. The Aztecs had a belief of in their mythology that Quetzalcoatl would return. That was something that they firmly believed in. Myths are not false stories. Myths are in fact statements about the world that are believed to be true and act upon whenever common response is required. So they are in fact statements about the world. So I want you to key in on that. The other thing that I'd like you to key on is Jared Diamond's work on Guns, Germs, and Steel, where he literally explains to you how a small band of individuals could in fact conquer a larger group. Also, be aware that these Native American societies were quite organized, quite fluid, and quite dynamic. And the fact that these were not illiterate, scattered, small populations living in North America. These were highly organized cities with hundreds of thousands of people in them, contrary to popular belief. Okay, so that ends the Meeting of Civilizations and First Founders.